When people talk about the great Syrah vineyards or Shiraz vineyards anywhere in the world, there's usually one hill that pops into people's minds. It's a striking image of steep slope with terraced vineyards that tumble down towards a little town that runs along a river valley. And then 3/4 of the way up that hill against the skyline is a stone chapel crowning the hill. That hill is Hermitage. And for many wine lovers, that is the most archetypal or iconic expression of Syrah or Shiraz of any region anywhere in the world. Now, Hermitage is really quite a small little appellation in the northern Rhone, and it's 75% Syrah. In fact, even if producers wanted to plant other grapes, they really couldn't, because the only red grape allowed is Syrah. And of course, there are smatterings here and there of Marsanne and Roussanne that are both white cultivars, and that makes up the other 25%. But while this hill really is visually imposing and iconic, it's not just the lay of the land that makes Hermitage so special. It's also the way the vines are planted, because they're not bush vines and they're not trellised vines. They appear to be single vines planted and then attached to a single wooden stake in the ground. Now, these are echelas vineyards, or stok by paaltjie, which in Afrikaans literally means a vine next to a pole. And you might be interested to know that this technique of vine planting was pioneered as a global first centuries ago in the northern Rhone, in places like Hermitage or Côte Rôtie, which is another famous hill covered in Syrah vines in the northern Rhone. Echelas vineyards are a really clever farming solution for steep, windy hills. Mostly because while you could use bush vines, which grow low to the ground and therefore kind of protect themselves against wind, the fruit that ripens on bush vines is often unevenly ripened because the leaves and foliage protect the fruit. So then you could lift those vines up on long trellises, which then would hold the fruit up so that it can ripen evenly under the sun. But when the wind blows every which way, as it's prone to do, those connected vines form a barrier that wind feels it has no choice other than to obliterate in its path down or across the hill. Now, echelas vines fall happily into the middle, where the vine holds them upright enough for the fruit to see the sun and ripen evenly, but because they're not connected to a whole bunch of other vines, they don't form that really annoying barrier that just pisses wind off and forces it to smash it as it blows through the vineyard. It can find its own path between all of those echelas. So you can see how the conditions that I've just described really all work together to create that iconic Hermitage scene. Steep hill, echelas vineyards tumbling down, Syrah vines alongside Roussanne and Marsanne going down to a little town and a fertile river valley. So you can imagine my surprise when I zoomed into the vineyards that produced the fruit for today's Hand Drink Solo Curious Wine of the Day and discovered a steep slope with echelas vineyards made of Syrah and Roussanne, which tumbled down towards a fertile river valley. But this was not France's Hermitage. This was in fact the Breedekloof Valley in South Africa. And for those of you who can handle the tension no longer, I'll tell you, today's curious wine is the Olifantsberg Soul of the Mountain The Bull red blend, which is made by winemaker Elizme Visser. Olifantsberg as a producer has long been a favorite of the Hand Drink Solo Wine Club, and I've oft referred to winemaker Elizme Visser as a kind of Princess Leia character, a rebel who fights against the empire being the rather large bulk wine oriented wine industry that makes up 99% of the Breedekloof wine region. But I realized that this comparison to Princess Leia is unfair for two reasons. First of all, Elizme really isn't the only one who's fighting against this bulk ethos, and there are a handful of really top-flight premium wine producers who excel especially in their area of Chenin Blanc, and there's a list of producers that you can see right here. The other reason it's unfair is because Olifantsberg really shouldn't be connected to the Breedekloof at all. Because despite the fact that it says on the bottle wine of origin Breedekloof, the Olifantsberg estate may as well be on another planet. It resembles absolutely nothing like anything else anywhere in the Breedekloof. Here are just a few specifics that might explain why I think Olifantsberg really should be treated as a creature all on its own. For starters, the vineyards that produce the fruit for the Bull Red Blend lie between 300 meters above sea level and 500 meters above sea level. To give you context, that dramatic Hermitage hill that we saw earlier has its absolute highest vineyards at about 344 meters. So even the lowest vineyards that produce fruit for the Bull are amongst the highest vineyards in Hermitage. What's more, those 500-meter vineyards on Olifantsberg are absolutely dwarfed by these massive black hulking mountains that surround it and cast long shadows over the valley, and which in winter then become snow-capped, delivering an absolutely icy winter, which keeps those vines super dormant until spring, when that meltwater eventually trickles down back into the valley. And at this point you may say, Han, you really have been going on for quite some time now on slopes and altitude. And I don't apologize for that, because to really get the brilliance of today's wine, you have to understand both the science and, I guess, to a certain extent, the mythology of vineyards on slopes. Traditional old world viticultural wisdom would tell you that at the bottom of any slope, the soils are thick and deep and fertile, and which sounds like a good thing, but vines that grow there often have too much nutrients, and therefore have too much energy and vigor and produce too much fruit, and the wines often lack concentration or intensity. And then at the very top of the hill, you have the opposite. You've got very poor rocky soils with almost no potential, and so the vines that grow up there are stressed to the point where they can't even ripen the few bunches of grapes that they have managed to produce. And that really only leaves the middle of the slope. And this is why in traditional old world European wine regions, the middle of the slope is usually where you'll find those big fancy Grand Cru and special vineyard sites that are kind of the Goldilocks for the best wines that region can produce. The problem with that traditional way of thinking about slopes is that traditional thinking in the wine world specifically has a way of standing still even when science moves forward. A classic example would be the fairly well-known concept of Goute de Terroir, or the taste of the soil, which says something along the lines of, well, in a region where you have chalky soils, you shouldn't be at all surprised to find chalk in the wine, because the taste of the soil is taken up by the roots into the stems, up into the petioles, and the petioles then dump loads of chalk into the grapes, and you have chalk in the wine, which sounds really lovely, except that it's total Uncle Banana. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that, botanically speaking, grapevines are incapable of sucking chalk dust up and depositing it into bunches of grapes. In fact, no soil of any type is ever sucked up by vines and deposited into bunches of grapes. So what is the state of affairs then when it comes to science and vines? Well, modern soil science does tell us that soils very definitely affect how vines behave. But viticulture has also given growers and viticulturists and winemakers plenty of options and devices that they can use in order to mitigate those circumstances. For example, you can swap out a rootstock on your vines so that when you plant them in fertile soils, the roots themselves can stop the vine from overcropping. Also, in contrast to Hermitage, where if you have a spot that doesn't make good Syrah, Marsanne or Roussanne, you're kind of screwed. In a place like Olifantsberg Wine Estate, for example, you can take different spots that may be suited to different cultivars. And so instead of having this weird linear progression from bad slope to excellent slope to bad slope, you can have a series of very different but equally excellent slopes as you climb the progression, for example, say between 300 meters above sea level and 500 meters above sea level. And that is exactly what today's wine is all about. The Soul of the Mountain Bull Red Blend is a fascinating assembly of parcels of fruit from 10 vineyards, and the wine is a final blend of Syrah, Grenache, Mourvèdre, and Carignan, which I guess their connection to the old world is that all of those cultivars grow within the broader Rhone Valley. But what's fascinating about this wine is because of the way the estate is laid out, each site is very distinct, and so each parcel kind of communicates a completely different part of the estate, which means that, in the words of Elizme Visser, the wine itself almost serves as a map to the estate of Olifantsberg. But rather than have me try and explain it, I think I've spoken enough, so I'll just let you listen to Elizme explain it in her own words.
The concept of the bull started back in the day when the farm was designed with the first plantings in mind. The Olifantsberg are between 300 and 500 meters above sea level. And as you go towards the top end of the farm, the soils become more marginal, more shallow, more challenging, more windswept as well. But there's a beautiful change in not only elevation, but also the direction of the slope. So fully northwesterly to the bottom part of the farm, very close to the cellar, and then we almost go full on north facing at the top. There's about a 3 degrees drop from the valley floor of the Breedekloof towards the top end of the Olifantsberg. So there is a good portion of Syrah planted, but more modern good clones. So clone 9, 470, 22, 21, a combination of trellis vineyards and echelas. The echelas being from 6,600 to 7,500 vines per hectare. So the Syrah was well thought through, all on raster rootstock. So all of it was keeping in mind that it's a more drier mountain slope. Just to give you an idea, the amount of rain on the Olifantsberg versus the central part of Breedekloof, it's a third of the total of Slangehoek and half of the rain that Goute gets. So Syrah was planted with Grenache, Carignan, and Mourvèdre. On the Carignan, we've got 3 vineyards, and on the Mourvèdre, we have 2 vineyards, and on the Grenache, we've got 1 big vineyard of 2 hectares, but that spans 3 different clones. So 1064, 513, and clone 70. All of these vineyards were perfectly planted in spots that encourage fruit purity and natural complexity. So we start harvesting the first Syrah at the end of January, and then we end up with the last block of Mourvèdre towards the first week of March at the latest. So it is incredible to be able to pick all these vineyards as a snapshot of that moment in that vineyard, in that vintage, and then producing each wine separately, and then having all of these beautiful elements of the farm to be blended into one wine, giving us the complexity we need for the bull.
Okay, so now that we understand the mountain, let's get into the glass to see what it tastes like. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, there really is a lovely mix of fruit and herbs and earth. And alongside this, there's these 2 quite distinct little mineral elements of gravel and iron. Now, I was a little disparaging earlier about the Goute de Terroir and the idea that somehow chalk travels up into a vine and into the grapes. Botanically, that's nonsense. But that doesn't mean the correlation doesn't exist, because there are regions where chalky soils exist and there are chalky qualities in a Chardonnay that grows in those chalky soils. It's just not there because it's from the soil. And you really get that same effect here. There are these beautiful earthy hues of struck smoky flint and crushed rock and gravel and even moist terracotta pot. But this wine is definitely more than just an old archaeological dig site. There's other stuff too, more botanical stuff. There are touches of dried herbs, maybe oregano, and even a little bit of floral lavender as it begins to open up. There's also a sweeter note, almost candied red licorice, kind of akin to perhaps also some dried fennel. And then perhaps to kind of bookend those aromas, you got sweeter touches of plum, but also smoky, slightly savory tones of charcuterie. But let's get into the glass and see how that follows onto the palate. Well, if any of you love the aromas and were worried that there would be a lack of continuity, those fears have been allayed. It's this moody, serious wine that almost opens with like a vine-ripened Tuscan tomato. I must be honest, I have no idea the difference between Tuscan tomatoes and Israeli tomatoes. I can learn that, but currently let's just pretend it's Tuscan. And then alongside that, you've got these plum skins, but they're kind of savory. It's like roasted plum skins. So you have those Maillard reactions going on. Again, the fruit is there, but it's a savory roasted fruit. And then it does open up. So those fruit elements kind of present themselves a little more boldly. So you get ripe cherry, even a sense of like blood orange, bitter blood orange pith in there as well. And dried coriander seeds. There's that herb, spice, touch of floral, savory, sweet. It's just hugely complex. Perhaps the beauty of this blend is that it doesn't really taste anything like one particular one of the cultivars. Hugely complex. And perhaps the beauty here is that there's no single cultivar that dominates. It really is this beautiful melded whole. And the more you taste it in the glass, the more you do begin to feel like you're kind of drinking your way through a treasure map. In fact, I don't think it's too strong to say that this is one of those holy grail type moments where you'll get even the grumpiest old cantankerous wine critic who it feels like has lost all joy in life, and yet they'll taste a wine like this that manages to be supremely intense, but somehow nimble and light-footed, and usually they'll lean back and sigh wistfully, crack a small smile that no one is allowed to notice, and then go, weightless intensity. Weightless intensity. And that really is what we have going on in this class. So that's all we have time for today. But while you drink the rest of the bottle, I'm going to leave you links to 2 more videos, both of which talk about Olifantsberg wines, because I didn't really get enough time to, first of all, talk about Elizme's husband, Ferdi, and what an absolute wine nerd he is in the highest order. And I also didn't get to talk about the amazing work that this team does with old vine Chenin Blanc, which is another element of this that you have to explore. And there's also Roussa. There's just too much to say about this estate. So I'll leave you for now, and we'll talk more next time. Until that next time, stay curious and always drink niche.